let's begin. So in Melachim Aleph Perek Chet, make this a little bigger. Az yakel Shlomo et Ziknei Yisrael et Roshei Hamatot Nesiei Ha'avot Livnei Yisrael El HaMelech Shlomo Yerushalayim Ha'alot et Aron Brit Hashem Be'ir David Hitzion. Okay, so this is the culmination of the Hanukkah David, where Shlomo is now going to bring the Aron, where it's been housed until now in Ir David, into the Beit HaMikdash, right? So we all know the story of the Aron coming up to Yerushalayim. It's a Haftorah and so forth, but David brings it up in anticipation of building the Beit HaMikdash, but then he doesn't get to build the Beit HaMikdash. But nonetheless, the Aron is still housed in the city of David. Vayikalu el HaMelech Shlomo kol ish Yisrael b'yerech ha'eitan b'chag hu hachodesh hashvi'i. So everybody gathers together to Shlomo HaMelech, to Solomon the king, all the people of Israel, in the month of Eitanim, with the Chag, which would be Sukkot, Chodesh HaShvi'i, the 7th month, right? Vayavo kol ziknei Yisrael kohanim et Aaron. All of the elders of Israel came, and the Kohanim carried the Aron. Now, we learned in the Parshat not that long ago, back in Parshat Bamidbar. Let's go back here for a second. If you were paying attention in Parshat Bamidbar, so we learn about the tasks were given to Bnei Levi. So some to the Kohanim and some to Bnei Levi. In Perek Dalet in Bamidbar, it says, "V'dibesh Shema b'Shem Yaron Ne'emor Nasot Rosh Bnei Kahat Mitoch Bnei Levi Lemishpachotam Netavotam," and so forth. V'skiv Zot Avodat Bnei Kahat Be'ol Moed Kodesh HaKodeshim. This is the service of the sons of Kahat in the Ol Moed, Kodesh HaKodeshim. So what does that mean? It's now it explains. So, in other words, what we're going to see is that Bnei Kahat were going to be in charge of moving the Kodesh HaKodeshim. That is the Kelim, including the Aron. And it goes like the first, Aaron and his sons, in Soah HaMachaneh, when the camp is going to travel, they come, the Horidu et Parochet HaMasach, they remove the Parochet, the Chisuva et Aron HaIdut, and they cover the Aron with the Parochet. And then on top of that, Pasuk Vav Natnu Alav Kasui or Tachash, they place upon it a covering of tachash skin. It's not clear exactly what a tachash is. I don't know how they translate it here. It's not clear. It's not look at the Gemara about a tachash if it's a behemah or a chaya. In any event, it was they take that skin. So first the Aron is covered with a parochet, and then it's covered with the tachash. And then it's covered entirely with a beged tchelet. Beged tchelet, a piece of cloth that's entirely tchelet. It's blue wool, milamala. Samu badad, and they place the badim. Now this little phrase here has to be explained because we. I'm skipping around here, so I apologize. I hope it all holds together. We learn way back in Shmot. Uh, we'll come back to this maybe a little bit later today. But when we learn in Shmot, in Parshat Truma, about the building of the Aron, so one of the things it says, "Vasita badei atzei shitim v'tzibito otam zahav." You make staves of acacia wood and cover them with gold. Vehevetet abadim b'tabaot, and you'll bring the staves into the rings, right? The rings are on the sides of the Aron, Altzalot Aron, on the sides of the Aron, Asetat Aron behem, to carry the Aron with them. B'tabaot Aron Yehu abadim, the badim, the staves, will be in these rings of Aron, lo yasuru mimenu. They will not be removed from them. So there's an idea that you're not allowed to remove the badim at all. Just bear that in mind. And so forth. So this idea, we'll come back to this because what we're going to see is that on the one hand, the badim presumably are never removed. And there is an idea that the way the badim are made is that most of the length of the stave is narrow, but at each end it's wide, right? So that if it comes to either end, you can't pull it out. But there is an idea that they are movable within the rings, right? They're not necessarily stationary. So when we see the Samu, right here, it says, I've lost my train of thought. We had a pasuk that says this. We had the pasuk that says Samu et Badav. Just a second. Vayilu et Aron. Right, they brought up the Aron. All right, let's continue reading. We'll come back to it. Vayilu et Aron Hashem et al moed et kol klei hakodesh asher ba'ohel. Vayilu et hamakohanim va'aleviim. So they bring up the Aron and the Ohel Moed, all of the holy vessels that were in the Ohel, that were in the Mishkan. And they brought them up, the Kohanim v'Halavim, the Kohanim and the Levim. Amel Shomo v'chol adat Yisrael hanoadim alav, ito ifnei Aaron, and the King Solomon, and all of the congregation of Israel that were meeting there with him in front of the Aron, right? So they brought a lot of cattle and a lot of sheep as korbanot. So the Kohanim bring the Aron to its place, to the Dvir of the Bayit. Again, this word Dvir here seems to refer to the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and we saw elsewhere it refers to the wall that separates the Kodesh from the Kodesh HaKodeshim, but here it seems that it refers to Kodesh HaKodeshim, to the Devir of the house, to the Kodesh HaKodeshim, or you could say it means they brought it up to the opening that's in the Devir, and then brought it further into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Al Tachat Kanfei HaKruvim, under the wings of the Kruvim. So we see the Kruvim were already there, and this is Bayit Shel Shlomo. So it's these huge Kruvim that are 10 amot high, with altogether a 20 amah wingspan, and they put the Aron underneath the wings of the Kruvim. Ki HaKruvim porsin kanayim mamakom ha'aron, because the Kruvim have their wings spread to the place of the Aron. In other words, over where the Aron is going to be. Vayasoku HaKruvim ha'aron yalbadav milamala. And the Kruvim will cover by a soku, like a sukkah, right? They're going to cover over the place of the Aron. And it says Aharon and Al Badav, and on it stays, Yilamala, from above. So when it says Aharon, we can understand. Now we don't know, and we saw all these psukim about the Kruvim. We know how long the wingspan of the Kruvim was. We don't really know how wide the wings were. We could guess, right? But it's just going to be a guess. If we imagine that each Kruv is 10 out high, that's pretty high, right? In other words, it's taller than a typical person. Chazal say a typical person is 3 amot, which maybe nowadays it's more, but 10 amot is very high. All right, if we're talking about amot, by the way, this is a machloket in the Gemara, but let's say we're talking about the amot that are 6 tfachim, and if each tefach, let's say, is 10 centimeters, right? So you have 60 centimeters times 10, you have 600 centimeters, 6 meters. This is very high, right? These are very high kruvim. So we would imagine that they're going to have a certain, okay, we talked about this question of how wide they are. We don't know exactly how wide they are. Sorry, hold on a second. I think they come at the same time every week now. Can you all hear that? Do you hear the music?
It's indistinct, but I hear it.
Yeah, I can vaguely hear it. That's our the Nanachs, right?
Yeah. The Nachmaniacs, I call them. They're at I'm hoping they're just at the light, waiting for the light to turn. Yeah, I think so. I think as soon as the light changes. Okay. I apologize. I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to wait till they move. It's just too much for me. Okay. Wow. All right. So what I was saying is that we don't know precisely how big we know how tall the kruvim were, we know what their wingspan is. We don't know quite how wide the wings are. But it says that they cover over the Aron and the Badim from above. So, of course, one of the questions we would ask just technically is, when it says they cover, that the wings cover the Aron and the Badim, does it mean covers all of the Aron and all all of the badim, right? In other words, the whole length of the badim. It doesn't mean it just covers the aron and the part of the right badim are attached to the aron. So some of the badim are going to be covered over in the same width of wing as the aron, right? But would they cover the whole length of the badim? So not necessarily. And I think we'll look later at the Mefarshim to talk about that. Now here it says interesting. It says Vayavu habadim. They lengthened the badim. Vayerau roshei habadim min hakodesh al pnei hadvir. V'lo yerau achutza. Vayu sham ad hayom hazeh. So this needs some explanation. They lengthened, they made long the staves. Vayerau roshei habadim min hakodesh al pnei hadvir. The heads, the ends, the heads of the staves were seen from the Kodesh on the front of the Dvir. Below Yera'u achutza, but they were not seen outside. Vayusham ad hayom hazeh. They were there until this day. So, what's the reality that it's describing? Now we didn't talk about this, but we should talk about it. There's an opening in the Dvir, right? In other words, until now we haven't talked about this. Maybe I mentioned before, but so we know in the Mishkan there was a separation between the Kodesh and the Kodeshim by way of the Parochet. And the Kohen Gadol, presumably, he just goes in one side of the Parochet when he has to go into the Kodesh. When he has to go in the Kodesh Kodeshim. And we know in Beit Sheni from the Mishnah that there were two Parochot, and it was pulled back on the southern side by an Amba, and the Kohen goes in there and he walks in between the two Parochot. And he enters the Kodesh HaKodeshim on the northern side, where it's pulled back, and the second Parochet. How did he enter in Beit Rishon? So in Beit Rishon, there's a doorway in the middle of the Dvir, middle of this wall. There's a doorway, and there are actually doors. But the doors are open and it's covered by a parochet. So the main division is really the wall. Here, you have an opening. It's covered by a parochet. And what seems to be described here is that the Kohanim bring the Aron into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and then they lengthen the Badim. So how do we understand Vayarichu, that they lengthened the Badim? What does that seem to mean?
It sounds like it's like telescoping, but I don't think they did that in those days.
Actually, that's an interesting idea, which I hadn't thought of. Nobody brings it up, although the truth is it's a possibility. That's a very interesting possibility. But so what's the thing? So what we said is this, right? That there are badim in this aron from the time of Moshe, and I think we pointed out a couple of shiurim ago that despite the fact that the Torah gives us the measurements for the aron, And it tells us that we have to put badim into the tabot. It doesn't give us the measurement badim. We don't actually know from the Torah how long the were or were supposed to be. Right? That's a bit of a that's a bit of history. This is presumably the same Aron, right? This is the same Aron that was from the time of Moshe, which has traveled with the Mishkan up until this time. And now it's being brought into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. So when it says Vayarichu HaBadim, that they lengthened the Badim, so we might be tempted to say that they added on to them. They made them longer. And that's actually a possibility. The question is how would you do that? How do you make them longer? You can't remove them. You're right, that we saw in Shmot, there's a Nisur of removing them from the Tabaot. So to make them longer, how would you do that? So maybe there's a way that you fuse it up. But remember, the Badim are wool covered with gold. So it's not so simple just to add them on, but I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's possible. Another way of understanding it by Abadim is not that they actually made the staves longer, but they lengthened them they pulled them out toward the Heichal, toward the Paroch. So the idea is by Yarichu Badim, they pull. Let's understand it like that. They pulled them out the longer toward the Parochet, which is covering the entrance to the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Vayera'u Roshei HaBadim Mina Kodesh. So the heads of the Badim were seen from the Kodesh. When you're standing in the Heichal, you can see the heads of the Badim al pnei hadvir, on the face of the Dvir, v'lo yera'u achutza, and they were not seen outside. Outside of what?
Outside the Kodesh HaKodeshim.
Outside the Kodesh HaKodeshim. But okay, so what's the reality it's describing? So as we'll see in a moment, Chazal understood this to mean that, right? So there's this parochet. So it says Vayera'u Roshei HaBadim Min HaKodesh, that they were seen. What does it mean they were seen? There's a parochet in between. And it also says Lo Yera'u Achutza. They were not seen outside of it. So
they just touched the parochet.
And then what? And then what do you see?
And then I don't know how the Kohen Gadol can get in, because he has to get over the badim. It's possible he has to leap over the badim. How would he get inside?
Yeah, right. So that of course is one of the questions. That is one of the questions, exactly. I'll come back to that question, or at least the way I understand it in a moment. But yeah, we need to understand how that's happening. So just to remind ourselves, no, just a sec. Just to remind ourselves a little bit about what's going on. This is my, let's pretend that this is an overhead view of the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Obviously not to scale, because this should be a square, but you'll take my word for it. Let's make the parochet purple. And let's make the Aron orangish to be like gold. Now, one of the things that we already learned is that all the Aron was lengthwise going from north to south. So the length is parallel to the eastern and western wall, right? Whereas the Shulchan, for example, is lengthwise from east to west. And we're not going to do that today, but I do think we're going to look at that. So let's just let's make a little tzur, illustration. Let's say that's the Aron. Let's make the badim to the Aron. No, I would make them yellow, but I'm not sure how white shows up. So let's make them green. So now we understand that the badim would be like this. Right? We learned that the badim are attached on the width side and not the length, right? In other words, the short side and not the long side. And so this is what it would be. So if you're standing, if you're a person, let's pretend this is a person standing here and looking. So what you would see, you wouldn't actually see the badim, but you would see these little impressions in the parochet, where the heads of the badim are sticking into the parochet, right? The Gemara talks about that here in our Masechet in Yoma. There's a sugya here, right? So you remember the Mishnah that talks about the Even Shtiyah. Mishin Nital Aron Even Hayta Sham Mimot Nevi'im Shonim. So from the time the Aron was taken, there was a stone there from the time of the early prophets, the first prophets. So Shtiyah Haytan great. It was called Shtiyah. Gavo min haaretz shalosh etzbot. It was 3 fingers high from the ground. V'aleh haya noten, and he would put on it. In other words, he's going to the Kohen Gadol when he comes in. He's going to put the maftah with the coal on the Even Shtiyah, and then he's going to put the Ketoret on it. Let's skip this part. And here there's a discussion about what exactly happened to the Aron, which I think we should look at, but not necessarily today. Okay. I'm going to skip all this other stuff. We should come back to it because I think you'd all be interested to know this discussion about what happened to the Aron and the different opinions about what happened to the Aron. They didn't account for Indiana Jones, but I covered a lot of bases. Rabbi Yehuda Rami. Now, this is what we're up to. Rabbi Yehuda Rami. Rabbi Yehuda threw, right? Rami meaning that he's going to throw 2 different sources together that seem to contradict. Vayera'u roshei habadim, uchti yera'u achutza. Right, so he's bringing the 2 parts of the same pasuk, which seem to contradict, because the first part, Vayera'u roshei habadim, Shalinyan, right? What's the pshat? Could actually see the heads of the badim in the kodesh. Uchtiv, but it also says velo yera'u achutza, and they couldn't be seen. They weren't seen outside, and as Paul said, meaning presumably outside of the kodesh kodeshim. Haketzad. So how would that be? Nirin ve'ein nirin. They're seen and they're not seen, but not in the way that we talked about with the Aron, right? Which is there, but it takes up no space. They're seen and they're not seen, in the sense that we just described in Tanya Nami Hachi, and we learned this also in the Braita. Ve'yera'u roshei avadim yachol lo yehu zazim mimkoman. So it could be that they don't move from their place. Talmud lomar vayarichu habadim. But the pasuk there in Melachim says that the badim were lengthened. Yahu yehu mekarin beparochet yotzin. So maybe you think that they tore through the parochet and came out, right? Because that's another way of understanding it. That when it says ve'eru roshei badim, so there's a parochet there. Maybe they made holes for the head of the roshei badim to be seen. Talmud Lamar, but that's apparently not what happened, because the same pasuk says that the heads of them were not seen outside. Haketzad. So how does it work? Dochkinu boltin seen beparochet. V'nirin kishnei dadei isha. Right, that they would push against the parochet boltin, and then they would stick out. In other words, their impressions would stick out of the parochet. Yotzim beparochet, and they would look like two nipples of a woman, right? That's lo bichti, right? It's not for nothing. They use that image. Shnamar Surah Hamor do dili ben Shaddai yali. Right? So this pasuk, in other words, they're taking it's an image that's mentioned, that's alluded to in Shir HaShirim. Sror Hamor do dili. Ben Shaddai yali. So, my beloved is to me as a bag of myrrh that lies between my breasts. So there is this idea that in fact the badim, the roshei badim that poke at the parochet, are supposed to evoke an image of the breasts of a woman, and that seems to indicate something about the badim and the aron. The aron is right. It is would be the aron, as it would be the woman, right? That would be the main thing. It's a very striking image. But this is so. It's not just that the Gemara describes this reality. The Gemara is just trying to learn pshat in this pasuk in Melachim, and the way the pshat comes out is like that the roshei badim are poking against the parochet, but the Gemara seems to understand that there's a reason for that. In other words, it didn't have to be that way, but I mean that's how it's described in Sefer Melachim. So the idea seems to be that the way the badim are set up, it's supposed to evoke this image that is referenced in Shir HaShirim. That's certainly at least one way of understanding it. If you see what I'm getting at, that because why should it be that the roshei badim are poking against the parochet? Why should that be? So apparently it's there to evoke a certain image. I want to read a little bit further on even though it's not immediately for what I want to talk about. But this is a Gemara here, Amar of Katina. This is brought here, and it's also brought in the Gemara Menachot. Amar of Katina, B'sha'ah shayu Yisrael olim l'regel, Bigal olim lahem et ha'parochet, umarim lahem et ha'kruvim, shayu mu'urim ze b'zeh. Yomrim lahem, so Rav Katina says that when Israel came up for Aliyah Regel, they would roll up for them or roll back for them the parochet, and they would show them the kruvim. Shahayu mu'urim ze b'zeh, that they were mixed with one another, touching one another. Yomrim lahen, and they would say to them, they, presumably the Kohanim who were exposing this to them, Ru'uchi b'atchem b'fnei makom, see your chibah. How do you say chibah?
Affection.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good. Thank you. See your affection before God, like the affection of a male and female, a man and a woman. So this is quite a striking image, and it raises a lot of questions about exactly when this took place. When was this? Right. So Rav Katina must be talking about either the Mishkan or Bayit Shel Shlomo, right? Because in Bayit Sheni they didn't have anything to show them. So he's talking about, and when he talks about Aliyah L'Regel, presumably now he's really only talking about Bayit Rishon, because there wasn't really Aliyah L'Regel in the Midbar per se. Although there was Aliyah Regel when the Mishkan was in different places before they brought to Yerushalayim. Okay, so Yesh Lama.
But then you have to explain why Israel is allowed to get into the Kodesh.
Right. So the question is, right, this is all well and good, but how did they actually see it? Did they go all the way into the Kodesh? No, you could answer that by saying that they didn't go all the way into the Kodesh, that they opened up the opening to the Kodesh, and then through that you could see the opening into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. And this would work in Bayit Shel Shlomo. In theory, it should work in Bayit Shel Shlomo. Although, so in other words, I think it would mean they would be able to come up to Ezrat Kohanim, to the Azara, but it's not entirely obvious to me exactly how this works, because when you're standing in the Azara, you're not on the same level as the Kodesh. The Kodesh, remember, is there. I know. I was knocked out. What's the last thing you heard me say?
About the Beit Rishon, Beit Shel Shlomo, and the different levels looking in.
Right.
But in Shlomo's Beit Mikdash, the Kruvim were not mechubakim; they were standing on both sides. They didn't bow even over the
Yeah,
kaporet.
right, right. So this again, it raises the question exactly when this was. So maybe it's referring to the time of the Mishkan, at a time when people had to go to the Mishkan for Aliyah L'Regel. And that would also make it easier for them to peer inside, because it could be, right, there weren't steps up to the Mishkan. The Mishkan was on ground level. And so if you're standing at the proper distance away, but they open up, if they open up the parochet into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, then presumably you could stand from a certain distance and see it. So I think we'd have to land on that as being what it's talking about. But there is this idea that they showed them the Kruvim, which is quite interesting. And God willing, we'll come back to that, because I do want to look at the sugya in Menachot, and this is also, it's also brought there. Okay, let's go back for a moment to Melachim. Okay, sorry about that. Let's look at Rashi and the Radak on these psukim. I think we can skip here. Let's go to Pasuk Gimel. Vayavo kol ziknei Yisrael vayisur kohanim et ha'aron. So all the elders of Israel came, and the Kohanim carried the Aron. Vayalu et Aron Hashem v'adol moed v'kol klei hakodesh. Right, they bring up the Aron, the Ohel Moed, and all of the Kelim. They bring them, the Kohanim and the Leviim. Rashi says, "V'adol Moed shasa Moshe gnazo Shlomo nivne bayit rishon." Shlomo put the Mishkan per se in Niza when the Beit HaMikdash was built. K'moshe shaninu b'tosefta d'sota. Asher ba'otu. Okay. Now, Pasuk Vav, Vayaviu Kohanim et Aron Brit Hashem el Mekomo, el Dvir HaBayit el Kodesh HaKodeshim, el Tachat Kanf Kruvim. Rashi says, Kanfei HaKruvim, Otan Shasa Shlomo, Haomdim al Ragleihem Bekarka, Ve'ein Elu Kruvim Shel Kaporet Shel Al HaAron. So, they bring them under they bring the Aron underneath the wings of the Kruvim, meaning the wings of the Kruvim that Shlomo made, that are standing on their legs on the ground, that we've described in previous shiurim. Ve'ein elu Kruvim shel Kaporet shel Aron. And they're not the same as the Kruvim that are on the Kaporet on the Aron. One of the questions we had when we were going through the Gemara in Bava Batra is, were there still the Kruvim? Did we have two sets of Kruvim in Bayit Shel Shlomo? Did we have both the big ones of Shlomo and the ones that were on the Kaporet? Or some?
What did they do with the original Kruvim, the ones they were carrying around since the desert?
So here, what you see is the way Rashi understands. Rashi understands that they're still there, and there would be enough room for them. There's a discussion in the Gemara elsewhere about how tall the Aron was with the height of the Kruvim. There is a discussion in the Gemara about that. There would still be plenty of room to have the Aaron with the kaporet and the kruvim underneath the wings of the large kruvim that Shlomo built. There's plenty of room for them. But what it was not clear to us from the Gemara whether they were still there or not. But here, the way Rashi understands it, Stam, he doesn't say it explicitly, but it seems like he seems to acknowledge that there's this idea that the kruvim, that we have two sets of kruvim. We'll come back to that question in a moment, I think, in the Radak. El Makom all right, Ki Kruvim Porsim Kanafayim El Makom Ha'aron. So we looked at this pasuk. The Kruvim are stretching their wings to the place of the Aron. Rashi says, Mikir here, right, from wall to wall, the way it was explained earlier. They're stretching their wings to the place of the Aron because the wingspan goes from wall to wall, covers the whole width of the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Vayasoko akruvim ha'aron adav b'lamala. Vayarichu habadim vayeru roshei habadim min hakodesh apnei advir. Rashi says vayeru roshei habadim b'parochet shekeneged hapetach ba'amat traksun. Right, that you can see the heads of the badim in the parochet. That's at the front of the Keneged HaPetach, that's at the opening in the Amatraksin, right? And the Amatraksin, remembers, is what Chazal called that wall that separated the Kodesh from the Kodesh HaKodeshim in Beit Shel Shlomo. Yachol Yum Karim Ba'avi Yotzin. So it could be that they would make a hole in it, or they would rip the parochet and go out. Talmud Omar v'lo yera l'chutza. Haketzad dochinu boltin ke'en shnei dadei isha kinyan shneimar ben shedayalim. Rashi here is essentially just quoting the Gemara that we looked at a moment ago. Go back and look at the Radak here. Amrura, but Vayisuha Kohanim et Aaron. The Kohanim carried the Aaron. Amrura Botenu Zichronam Rivacha B'Shosha Mekomot Nasu Kohanim et Aaron. There were 3 times that the Kohanim carried the Aaron. Kishavru Yisrael et Yarden, ukishesavavu et Yericho, ukishehachziru limkomo kishebarach David mibnei Avshalom. Right, so these are the 3 places where the Kohanim carried the Aron. When they crossed over the Yarden, right, in Sefer Yoshua, the Kohanim have to dip their feet into the water, and then the waters of the Yarden stop flowing downward and they flow upward, and then they go in. Not long after, when they do the attack on Yericho, they have to carry the Aron around Yericho. And when they return it to its place, when David had run away because of Avshalom. The attack Kashich Nisu Beit HaMikdash Kodesh HaKodeshim, but also now when they're bringing it into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, but Chazal didn't count that, right? Because they said in 3 places. But here's a 4th place where the Kohanim carried the Aron. Maybe this is just what they mean by in the third instance where they return it to its place. This is the same idea, that they're just returning it to its place. All right, not vital for our discussion today, but an interesting aside. Vayalu et Aron, right? So they bring the Aron Hashem and the Ohel Moed, etc. The Radak says, et Aron Hashem mitzion. They bring the Aron Hashem from Tzion. Kamo shemar v'et Ohel Moed migivon kisham haya. So the Aron was brought from Tzion, which was Ir David, which they just mentioned a moment ago. but the Mishkan was still standing in Givon, and that was brought from Givon. So it's just a technical point that the Radak wants to point out. Ayelu otam Kohanim v'Halavim, and the Kohanim and the Levim brought them up. A Kohanim v'Halavim, the Radak says, the Kohanim ha'aron, right? So the Kohanim carried the Aron. Levim et Ohel Moed. The Levim brought the Ohel Moed, the Klei HaKodesh, and also the other vessels. Asher b'Ohel, b'Ohel Moed, Ganzu b'Otzrot Beit Elokim. So the Ohel Moed itself, in other words, the Mishkan gets buried, it gets hidden away in the treasures of the house of God. Right, but the Aron gets put into the Dvir. ויביאו הכהנים את ארון ברית השם מקומו אל דביר הבית, אל קודש הקודשים, אל תחת כנפי הכרובים. So Radak says a kruvim hichnis batchila, right? This seems to be obvious, right? In other words, this is what's implied. The kruvim were brought in first. As we know, right, that these kruvim are made by Shlomo, and they're standing on their legs, and they're facing the Heichal. And their wings are stretching from wall to wall, then kruv the kruv, and also from one kruv to the next. They bring the Aron underneath the wings. So the kruvim that Betzalel made are on the two edges of the kaporet, al ha'aron, on the Aron. They're covering over the Aron like they always were, like they were to begin with. These kruvim that Shlomo made, they were high up above the Aron. Because the kruv was 5 amot high. Vein sarich leguf hakruvim shahayal made benes. You don't need for the body of the kruvim to be standing by way of a nes. Ki aguf tachat haknafayim, because the body is underneath the wings. This is a reference, of course, to this discussion in the Gemara, right? The Radak is referring to this question in the Gemara, where the Gemara, as we learned and spent some time on, say that the kruvim of Shlomo stood by way of a nes. And he's saying you don't have to say that. And we'll see the Radak elsewhere where he talks a little bit more about that. He says you don't need to say that they stood by way of an nes because their bodies were underneath the knafayim, which you remember that was one of the objections to this idea that they stood by way of an nes, is just to say that maybe the bodies were altogether underneath the wings, and that's what the Radak is saying here would be the plain pshat. And we can't ask why Shlomo made other kruvim. In other words, he's saying, to put it differently, we don't know, right? So we don't have any way of asking why it is that Shlomo felt it necessary to make these other kruvim, in the same way that we don't know why he wasn't compelled to make another Aron, right? In other words, if he's already making other kruvim, why doesn't he make a new Aron, right? He keeps the old Aron, but he makes these other kruvim. And not like, and they weren't in the form of the first kruvim. ועשה מזבחות אחרים, מנורות ושולחנות וכלים אחרים. But he did make other mizbachot, and he did make other menorot, right? Because we didn't see this, but if you learned, right, Shlomo made 10 menorot, and he made 10 shulchanot, right? Those are things that are mefurash here in the Kra. Ki hakol asa al pi hanevuah, because all of these things were done by way of prophecy. Kamo shemasar lo David, Aviv, kamo shekatuv b'divrei Hayamim, shemar lo David, hakol, I think the second hakol is a mistake. Hakol bichtav miyad Hashem alai hiskil. Hakol bichtav, right? We've seen this before. Hakol bichtav miyad Hashem alai hiskil kol malachot hatavnit. This is what David says. Everything was written to me from the hand of God, and alai hiskil, he made it known to me. Not a good translation, but that's the idea. Or he made me aware of these forms, all of the malachot hatavnit, all of the works of the plan. So the Radak, in any event, doesn't venture a reason why certain things got changed in Bayit Shel Shlomo from Bayit Rishon. The Aron was preserved, but new kruvim are introduced. So we don't know why. If you were to ask me, who knows nothing, I think it may have something to do with this, with what we left off with last time. When in the Gemara in Baba Batra, we left off with this idea that the kruvim of Moshe face one another, and the kruvim of Shlomo are facing the Heichal. And we asked, like how, but they should really be doing the same thing. And so the answer, by different ways, either that the face of the kruvim of Shlomo would change depending on the state of the people, or that they were always at a kind of an angle. But maybe there's if we understand now that we have both sets of kruvim and Bayit Shel Shlomo, so how would it be? Just a second. Because I got disconnected. My illustration went away. Just a second. If this is the Aron, we'll just make it with the body. If we think of the kruvim, right? So I have like a kruv here and a kruv here. Sorry, these are not well done. I apologize. Right, but imagine that they're facing one another, and then I have these other kruvim here, like one here. Right? These are kilu, their wings. Actually, the wings, of course, would be much longer, right? Because they go over this. Okay. But let's say this is one face and this is another face. So these ones are facing out and these ones are facing each other. It raises this question about what was going on. Why was the Gemara so concerned about the way the kruvim of Shlomo were facing? if I have both sets of kruvim anyway, I have some that are always going to face each other and some that are always going to face outwards. Why do I need to reconcile those two? Right? When we learned the sugya, we said yes, they're psukim that seem to contradict because in the kruvim of Moshe, it says that they face one another. In the kruvim of Shlomo, it says that they're facing outwards, they're facing Neichal. We said, so, okay, so it's not a contradiction because that was Moshe and this is Shlomo. Like, why is it a thing? So we saw the Rashbam says, he adds in that the assumption of the Gemara is that it shouldn't be different one for the other, right? There's an underlying assumption that it should be something that fundamental difference should not be, that fundamentally they should be the same. But now, if we think that they both exist simultaneously, right? That the Aron of Moshe exists with the kaporet and with the kruvim in Bayit Shel Shlomo, along with the kruvim of Shlomo, I think we have to rethink what that whole thing means. You could still learn it the same way we learned it last time, but I don't know. To me, it raises questions exactly what was bothering the Gemara there. It's all of a sudden not as clear to me what's so difficult. Let's go on a little bit here. Vayarichu habadim, vayeru roshei habadim, and so forth. Right. So what does it mean by arichu habadim? Harichu otam lachutz. They lengthened them outward. Klomar shemashku otam klapei chutz. They pulled them outward. Lefi shelo haya tzarich od laseit b'katef. Because they now no longer need to carry them on the shoulders. Right? So the idea being that when you had to carry them, so you have, however long the badim are, they're long enough that you can have two kohanim on each side. You have four kohanim carrying the aron. The Gemara says actually they would carry the aron facing each other. But we'll leave that for the moment. Now this is supposed to be Beit Olamim. So now the aron is not supposed to be carried anymore. And so now that you don't need to carry it anymore, now you could move the badim. You can't remove them because we saw the Torah says you're not allowed to remove them, but you could move them. Right, so we would understand that to begin with, the badim were put equally, in other words, they extended equally on each side when they were put in to begin with. That they would be extended on the back of the aron, the same length that they would be extended in the front of the aron. Because you have four people who are carrying it. For each stave, for each bad, you have two people, one in front and one in back. Okay, once they bring the aron into the devir, the way it was with its staves, and there was no longer going to be carried on the shoulders of the Kohanim. So they lengthened them, meaning they pulled them outward, until you could see the heads of them on the face of the Devir. Yoma Kippurim laktir bein habadim, in order that the Kohen Gadol could go in there on Yom Kippur to burn the Ktoret between the Badim, Lo yeponeh heina v'heina. He wouldn't be, and he wouldn't have to turn here and there. In other words, he could go directly in between the badim and put down the ktoret.
So he stays locked between the badim, it doesn't go further.
So that seems to be what the Radak is saying, right? It sounds like what it means is he's going directly in. And maybe it means that the parochet itself was divided. Either was divided or he can pull the parochet back enough that he can go in between these badim. And he knows exactly where to go because he sees where the badim are before he walks in. So he knows exactly where he's going.
By the way, this would mean that there are more than one lula on each side. There should be at least 2 rings.
Yeah,
because if not, the badim would fall down on one side.
Right. No, we know that. That's in Parshat Truma. The Arbat Tabaot are Arbat Slaot.
Arbat Tabaot. Okay.
Arbat Tabaot are Arbat Slaot. But it sounds like what you're saying. The Radak seems to say what you're saying. He wouldn't have to turn here and there. In other words, he wouldn't have to do some circuitous route to get there. He could go directly there. And that's why, according to the Radak, this was the reason, is so that when the Kohen Gadol needs to go in, he knows exactly where he needs to go before he goes in. He can see, based on where the Rosh Badim are, where he has to enter. So this would imply that when he enters, he's going to put the Ktoret down in between the Badim, facing west. He would be facing west, right? Because he's coming in from the east and he's going west. So does it mean that when he goes in, he faces west? Presumably, he wouldn't turn around to face east if he's in front of the Aron, because then his back would be to the Aron. And we know that he wouldn't put his back to the Aron. So let's just continue on here and see what we understand from the Radak.
As some people do with the Sefer Torah, when they put it in the Aron, they all the time face not everybody does this, but they all the time face the Aron and go backwards.
Right.
On the Bama.
Yes, that's brought down in halakha. You are supposed to do that. Like when you leave a shul, you're not supposed to turn your back even on the Aron, even when the Sefer Torah covered up in the parochet of the Aron. And we know this also about the Kohen Gadol, and the Rambam brings it down in Hilchot Avodat Yom Kippurim, that when the Kohen Gadol, he brings in the Ktoret, and when he goes out, he goes out the way he came in, or he doesn't turn around. He always keeps his face toward the Aron as he backs out. Maybe you'll say that the whole length of the badim is only 10 amot. The Torah doesn't say that they were seen like this outside of the parochet, but dvir haya rachbo 20 amot, and the dvir was even longer. It was 20 amot. Im kain, if that's true, afal pisha mashkutam, ayech vir'u adayin al pnei hadvir. How would they have extended long enough to be seen al pnei hadvir? In other words, if you take the Aron and you put it in the middle of the dvir, in the middle of the Kodesh HaKodeshim, so from the edge of from the Aron, that of course we have the Agadata that says that it took up no space. But okay, we also said that there was some corporeal aspect to it, because we see here, we're learning the psukim, they physically bring in the Aron into the into this space. And the Radak is also, he's not talking here about the Agadata. He's talking about like just what was the reality. If the Badim were 10 amot long, how do they reach far enough in front, even if I push them all the way in front, how do they reach to poke the parochet? So he's assuming that the Badim are 10 amot long. And now they're 10 amot long. The sides of the Aron are 1.5 amot. And you're not allowed to remove the Badim from the Tabaot. So the most that they would extend forward is 8.5 amot. So how do they get all the way to the parochet? אם כן, אף על פי שמשכו אותם, איך נראו עדיין על פני הדביר? נאמר כי לא נתנו הארון סמוך לכותל המערבי, אלא הרחיקו אותו מן הכותל. Right, so he gives a simple answer. He says, maybe they didn't put the Aron so close to the western wall. In other words, right? In other words, it doesn't say anywhere that the Aron has to be dead center in the middle of the Kodesh HaKodashim. So maybe they bring it away from the western wall toward the eastern wall, and then they bring it dafka far enough eastward so that the Roshei Badim will touch the parochet and stick out a little bit. And you don't have to say that the Aron was not counted as part of the measure. Uvanes haya omed, and it stood by way of a nes. Sha'arei betoch hamida haya tachat kanfei hakruvim betoch esri mama, because we see that it was within this measure, underneath that the pasuk here just described, that they're under the wings of the kruvim within this 20 amot span. And there wasn't 10 amot in all directions. In other words, he's pointing out, as the Radak will often do. Oh, wait a second. Are we okay? The Radak. I don't know if you've ever learned the Radak. I mean, I've quoted him here a number of times. When you learn through Nach with the Radak, one of the interesting things about the Radak is he will almost always bring you midrash on whatever it is that he's learning, and he had a very critical mind regarding midrash, and this is one of the equals, critical in the sense that here he's saying, I don't need this midrash. In other words, because sometimes he'll bring a midrash, and actually it will help you to understand the psukim in the pshat. But here he's saying, if I were to paraphrase, if we learn the plain pshat of what's going on here, I don't have any reason to bring this idea that the Aron didn't take up any space. I can answer all these questions and I can understand the psukim just fine without creating this idea that the Aron didn't take up any space. And he also says the same thing about the Kruvim. Vayusham ad hayom hazeh. They were there until this day. So he sirotam od min Aron, right? The Badim stayed where they were not removed from the Aron. Kamosha katuv lo yasur mimen, like we saw in the pasuk in Truma that I brought earlier, that the Torah forbids you from removing the Badim from the Aron. The gamlo hefzirotam ma'achorehem. They also didn't push them backwards. They are always pulled forward toward the front of the dvir. That's what it means until this day. Im came, so this tells you, this seems to imply that the doors that were on the Dvir, that were always open, they were never closed. So that's why Shlomo had to make a parochet to separate between the Dvir, between the Kodesh HaKodeshim and the Kodesh. I think for tonight, let's just do one more pasuk here, even though this is not immediately important to us, but I think it's an interesting thing. So the next pasuk here says, "Ein ba'aron rak shnei luchot ha'avanim asher hinich sham Moshe b'chorev." So the only thing that was in the Aron were the two tablets of law that Moshe placed there from Chorev. Now, when you read that, maybe you learned this elsewhere, right? According to Chazal, in the Aron, there was the Luchot, V'Shivrei Luchot, and the Sefer Torah that Moshe gave to Bnei Levi. And here, Shutosh Mikra is no, there were only the Luchot, meaning Luchot Hashniyim, right? The second set of Luchot. But here the Radak says this is just another example of the way he relates sometimes to Midrash. He says, Zera Aya ki lo hayu ba'aron lo shivrei luchot v'lo sefer Torah. The Aron bo sefer Torah nira ki natnuhu biotzrot beit Hashem. Whatever Aron held the sefer Torah that Moshe gave to Bnei Levi, they must have put that into the Otzrot Beit Hashem, into the temple treasure house. Imo HaMoed, along with the Ol Moed, Ima Kelim, and with whatever other Kelim. V'chein yireh midivrei Chilkiyahu Kohen, Sefer Torah Matzati B'bayit, right? So that's the story where Chilkiyahu Kohen finds a Sefer Torah and brings it to Yoshiyahu. Right? I'm sure you're all familiar with that story. And where does he find it? He says, Matzati b'Beit Hashem, nira ki lo haya b'makom shayu regilim bo. The way the story is told, that he found it, b'Beit Hashem, seems that he found it in a part of the temple that people didn't normally enter. Lo hayu yodim oto sham boto ador. They didn't know that it was there in that generation. So
a type of Gniza.
Exactly. In other words, so Beit Otzrot Hashem would be like a Geniza, and that's what's implied here. That they took the Ohel Moed. What does it mean? They took the Ohel Moed. So you don't need the Krashim now. You don't need the Yuriot, and you don't need the Ohel and all of that. So presumably all of that gets put into some other part of the Beit HaMikdash, which was a big enough structure. We haven't learned all about it, but we did touch on some of it. It has all these other places, right? It has these ta'im. There are 3 levels of ta'im that go all the way around north, west, and south. So there are places to put it, and not to mention that there'll be other places in the Azara, and there are other lishkot and so forth. So again, it's just interesting. The Radak here doesn't feel any obligation to explain or support these midrashim. Sometimes he will, and sometimes he won't. Here where he doesn't see a reason in Pshat to support the midrash, he'll point it out. That I'll do this in class next time, but the parallel to what we did today, you'll find Bet Parakeh beginning in Pasuk Bet. So there's a Hirush of Rashi on Tivrei means Muchas Rashi. We don't know exactly who wrote. And he goes at some length here, excuse me, talking about some of these issues. And also so does the Radak. The Radak here also talks about some of the things he talked about here, but he brings up some other issues. So we might look at it next time, I'm not sure. But based on what we saw in the Radak so far, it sounds like when the Kohen Gadol went into the Kodesh HaKodeshim on Yom Kippur, he went through this parochet directly in between the badim of the Aron. And it sounds like he would have been then facing, he would have put down the Machah and put the Torah there in front of the Aron, and he would have been facing west. And that's the way it sounds. So this is maybe at least one piece of information to help us understand where the Kohen Gadol in the Beit Hash. And if you remember, and also in Beit Sheni, and that may be how we'll understand the Mishnah that says that when he walked to the Kodesh HaKodeshim, that he went alongside the Parochet. He walked along, he comes in facing north, and then he faces south, and walks next to the Parochet until he gets to the place where he puts down the Machtah. So hopefully next week I'll try to bring this stuff together. But I think that's it for tonight. Any questions, comments? No. Good. Okay. So thanks all, and see you next week.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
תודה, יישר כוח.
All too.